Back in the 1930s, Japan was on this path of aggressive expansion that, well, it would eventually drag the entire world into war. But what was really driving this? It wasn't just about grabbing land or resources. It was about an idea, a really powerful belief system that became the engine for an entire empire. So let's pull back the curtain and really look at what was going on, what was fueling Japan's road to war.
And right at the heart of it all was this single, powerful phrase that you'd hear everywhere, in political speeches, in military orders, this belief in Japan's unique national destiny. Now, this wasn't just some catchy slogan. No way. This was the core belief, the central idea that would end up shaping how an entire nation saw itself and, more importantly, its place in the world.
And that's really the big question for us today, isn't it? What happens when a country's identity gets so tangled up with this idea of having a special purpose? Well, as we're about to see, it can completely transform everything: politics, diplomacy, and even the very definition of what peace and war mean.
To really get this, we've got to break this ideology down. It was basically built on three really powerful pillars that, when you put them all together, created this incredibly potent, kind of unshakable worldview. Okay, so pillar number one was this concept of kokutai, which basically means national essence. This was the core belief that Japan was just fundamentally different, totally unique, because of its sacred, unbroken imperial line that stretched back for ages. Under this idea, loyalty to the nation and loyalty to the emperor were the exact same thing. It created this intense, spiritual bond that fused your personal identity with the country's ambitions.
And you can probably see how an idea like this would completely change the rules of the game. The historian John W. Dower calls it a moral absolutism. And just think about that for a second. If you truly believe your nation's actions are serving a divine emperor and some kind of sacred destiny, then compromise. That doesn't look like smart diplomacy. It looks like dishonor. It looks like a betrayal.
But this ideology wasn't just built on spiritual belief, not at all. The second pillar was a deep, burning resentment. For decades, Japanese leaders and just regular citizens felt like they were getting slighted by the Western powers, and that feeling of grievance was an incredibly powerful way to get people fired up.
And this wasn't just some vague feeling, It was rooted in specific, stinging events. A proposal they made for racial equality at the Versailles Conference, it was shot down. Later on, naval treaties were seen as unfairly holding back Japan's military might. Again and again, the message seemed to be, no matter how modern or powerful Japan got, it would always be treated like a second-class power by the West. So now you have this really potent mix, right? A sense of divine mission combined with a deep-seated resentment. The third and final pillar is what gave them the moral justification to act on it: Pan-Asianism. This was the idea that Japan, as the most powerful non-Western nation, had a special duty to lead the rest of Asia.
And this is how aggression gets completely reframed. As the historian Louise Young explains, nationalism turned imperial expansion into a moral mission. With this story, invading other countries wasn't seen as an act of conquest. Nope. Instead, it was framed as this noble act of liberation, freeing fellow Asians from Western colonial rule. You can see how powerful and persuasive a story like that would be.
Okay, so we've got the ideological fuel, a sacred destiny, deep resentment, and this so-called moral mission. But these ideas didn't just stay in books and speeches. They became the actual blueprint for totally reshaping the Japanese state itself.
And this takeover? It happened in a few really clear steps. First, anyone who was critical got silenced. If you urged caution, you were just labeled unpatriotic. Simple as that. With dissent crushed, civilian politicians who might have favored diplomacy, they were weakened and lost their influence. This created a huge power vacuum, which the military was more than happy to fill, claiming they were the true voice of the emperor. The end result? Policy was just completely dominated by the military. Generals, not diplomats, were running the show now.
So the really crucial point here is this: nationalism wasn't just cheering from the sidelines. As historian Richard J. Smethurst points out, it actually enabled militarism from within the system. It created an environment where the military could seize total control of foreign policy without ever needing to stage a formal coup. The ideological victory came first, and the political one followed.
Okay, so this brings us to a really fascinating debate that historians have. Was this powerful nationalist ideology the main cause of Japan's expansion, or was it just a convenient justification for policies that were really driven by other things, like a need for resources?
There are basically two main schools of thought here. On one side, you have historians like John W. Dower, who argue that nationalism was a primary driver. It fundamentally changed the nation's entire worldview, making war seem not just possible but morally necessary. But on the other side, scholars like Akira Yuria suggest nationalism was more of a tool, something leaders used to rally public support for expansion that was really all about practical, economic, and strategic need.
So, which side is right? Was it the main cause, or just a convenient tool? Well, the most compelling analysis suggests it's not really an either-or question. It's more of a powerful synthesis of both ideas.
The verdict is that no, nationalism probably wasn't the sole cause of expansion. Japan had very real economic and strategic interests in places like Manchuria. But, and this is a big but, nationalism acted as a powerful accelerant. It radicalized those existing goals, it made compromise impossible, and it pushed the nation toward conflict much, much faster and more aggressively than it might have otherwise.
And this single sentence just nails it. It really brings it all together. Nationalism didn't necessarily light the fire, but it sure poured gasoline all over it, shaping its direction and its intensity. It was the force that made compromise impossible, put the military in the driver's seat, and turned a simple policy of expansion into a sacred, unstoppable national duty.
And that leaves us with a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond the 1930s. How does the story a nation tells about itself, about its destiny, its grievances, its mission, how does that ultimately shape its actions on the world stage? That's a question that's just as relevant today as it was back then.